The revolution had come. But what about the revolution of the mind? They had taken power, but now the Bolsheviks had to take over education. History would be crucial. It was where the revolution itself would be interpreted and justified going forward. As we talked about last video, the Bolsheviks viewed culture as inordinately linked to the revolution, making education a fundamental political necessity. As Lenin put it, the very term apolitical or non-political education is a piece of bourgeois hypocrisy, nothing but a humbuggery practiced on the masses. We must put the matter frankly and openly affirm, despite all the old untruths, that education cannot but be linked up with politics. So the old system had to be transformed. But as for how this would actually be done, there were all sorts of ideas in the revolutionary fervor. First, to give the lay of the land, in 1917, there were the 11 universities, and then about 100 institutes or technical schools. They were also joined by the Academy of Sciences, a small but highly prestigious research institute unique to Russia, which elected its academicians by multi-candidate secret ballot. Decades of skirmishes with czarist authorities had forged among the elite universities a kind of obsession with scientific purity and autonomy, the ideal of science for science's sake, outside government control. For them, the revolution ushered in much-needed independence. Elsewhere, the existing universities were challenged by grassroots projects to democratize education from the liberal populist tradition of spreading enlightenment to the masses. With the fall of Tsarism, new schools rapidly sprang up all across the country. Nearly every province and major city intended to found a university. All kinds of institutes were declared. Most prominently, the People's Universities movement envisioned independently funded, non-state-controlled schools open to all genders and classes. And now, by one estimate, 101 such universities had popped up by 1919. Then there was Bogdanov and his group, the Bolsheviks most concerned with proletarian culture. They spearheaded a new organization called Prolet Cult, envisioned as an all-encompassing cultural vanguard to complement the party's political vanguard. They also founded universities and attempted the first Soviet encyclopedias. Finally, the Central Committee also heeded the university idea, beginning in 1918 with the creation of the Socialist Academy of Social Sciences, later shortened to just the Communist Academy. Posturing to become the preeminent theoretical center of Marxism, the Academy served as a hub for party education and debates. Bogdanov's old course on Marxism actually served as a textbook at first, as did the famous ABC of Communism, written by Nikolay Bukharin and Yevgeny Preobrazhensky. The Academy was soon joined by the Sverdlov Communist University, the Institute of Red Professors, and many more in the coming years. As for the existing university system, in late 1918, the Bolsheviks effectively removed all barriers to college admissions. They abolished existing titles and degrees so that non-elites could more easily enter and rise through the ranks. And later, they required that professors and administrators be elected. A sort of affirmative action was created, choosing students based on political beliefs and proletarian backgrounds, which could be adjusted as needed. Further, in early 1919, the Bolsheviks established rabfaki, which were preparatory schools meant to quickly bring workers up to speed and into the universities, especially more pro-Soviet students. By 1922, the rabfaki numbered 64 in total, with about 25,000 students among them. Meanwhile, one of the people emerging from Bogdanov's circle was Anatoly Lunacharsky, appointed the first head of the People's Commissariat for Enlightenment, or Narkompros for short, which was the government ministry in charge of all matters of education, culture, and arts. An artist in his own right, Lunacharsky would prove sympathetic to the plight of scholars and artists, and would be a major influence in shaping education going forward. On the subject of history specifically, Lunacharsky summed up the Marxist attitude at the time quite well, remarking, "The old school was teaching love for the homeland, love for the fatherland. And now, some also say it is necessary to give the study of history a national character and to cultivate in students a healthy love for the homeland. I don't know what is meant by healthy love for one's homeland. Let's be completely objective in this regard and say, we need international human education. The old nationalistic style of history was a slippery slope toward competition and conflict, all of which antithetical to the ultimate goal of proletarian internationalism. On the topic of historical heroes, he added, the teaching of history, which yearns to find good role models in the examples of the past, must be abandoned. In sum, historiography had to eschew patriotic undertones, the national myths, the famous heroes, and all such things once the bedrock of history education. It had to think bigger than that. All these ideas were born out of a kind of early utopianism of the revolution, with grand visions for the future. However, plans quickly stalled as a result of the Civil War, as resources were thin and students were being transferred to the front. The party desperately recruited any communist teacher they could get their hands on, even major leaders, but in practice, they were usually too busy to teach. A surprising number of communist classes were instead taught by Mensheviks, anarchists, and other leftist dissidents at first. Either that or bourgeois academics. And for that matter, most of the students were too. There simply wasn't enough communists to go around, and those that were being trained were needed for running the country. The idea of free and open education for all was walked back, as at the moment, the government prioritized getting doctors graduated over, say, historians. Plus, in the old universities, it was slow going to change the political composition. Not only were communist students still in single digits, to the party's surprise, old professors were almost always re-elected anyway. As after all, if you dreamed of university all your life, would you rather study under a world-famous, albeit bourgeois professor, or whatever random communists they recruited? Evidently, even if they wanted to, the Bolsheviks didn't have the resources nor trained personnel yet to replace the old establishment entirely, and so they were forced to work with the bourgeois professors, creating a significant source of tension within Bolshevik ranks. Despite the fiery rhetoric, the party would for now try to keep the peace, beginning a period of uneasy coexistence. Plus, there was some hope the old professors could maybe be converted, with Lenin opining, the bourgeois intellectuals cannot be expelled and destroyed, but must be won over, remolded, assimilated, and re-educated. That said, relations in practice got off to a rocky start. Initially, professors were mostly hostile to the Bolshevik takeover, with many criticizing government policy, resigning, or even joining the white movement, which destabilized the universities further. As we'll see, a number of scholars would be forcefully deported, many more would die around this time, exacerbated by the poor conditions, and finally quite a lot of scholars fled. But nonetheless, when the dust settled, a sizable old guard remained, which was allowed to retain its teaching positions. Within the old guard was a wide array of beliefs. Sergei Platonov, for example, the country's leading historian post-Khrushchevsky, was an open conservative and former tutor of the royal family, stubbornly refusing Marxist historiography. Sergei Oldenburg, permanent secretary of the Academy of Sciences, was a former leader of the cadets, who now worked with the Soviets to preserve the academy. Conversely, those like Alexander Prizhnikov, Yevgeny Tarly, Dmitry Petrushevsky, and Rojkov, of course, had already been employing various degrees of Marxist analysis prior to the revolution, and so had no issue continuing. In the pre-revolution days, Marxist analysis had been a somewhat alluring countercultural trend in academia, though the government actually sanctioning it now made it less so. Plus, a handful of rising historians were party members outright. Just before the revolution, Alexey Shakhmatov pioneered textual analysis of the Rus Chronicles, creating a framework for dating and relating the texts to each other by study of their linguistic content, and pointing out how they reflected the political and cultural norms of their time, which became the basis for study of the Kievan Rus in the Soviet Union. Although a Normanist himself, meaning one who accepts the Varangian origins of the Rus, Shakhmatov reconstructed how the story of the Varangian invitation had been gradually invented and added to the Rus chronicles over time. His students also continued translation and publication of the Rus chronicles themselves, and in fact, some of these 1920s publications are still the standard editions used today. Then there was Nikolay Marr, a bourgeois historian turned enthusiastic government supporter who spearheaded Soviet material culture and linguistics. In Marr's view, the Indo-European-centric linguists of old willfully confused language and ethnicity in such a way as to perpetuate Western supremacy. In particular, he looked to his native Georgian, thought to be a language isolate, instead proposing a controversial new theory, the Japhetic theory, that once you remove Indo-European manipulation, all the people of the Caucasus could be traced to a single, distinct, Japhetic family. And actually, the more he looked, the more he found the Japhetites all across world civilization. Marr soon grew the Georgians from a language isolate to a well-connected ethnic group to the only one. In other words, his solution to the racist, Indo-Europeanist way of categorizing cultures and languages was to prove all humans were Japhetic. He argued there was no causal connection between biological or genetic categories and culture, ethnicity, or language. Rather, they were socioeconomic derived constructs, superstructural phenomena mirroring the economic base. Every stage in a society's socioeconomic development inevitably led to a new stage in language and thought. Languages were class-based, as in the actual linguistic structure and typology came about through class conflict. They could even be separated into their different class layers. The logical conclusion being, with the introduction of communism and the elimination of classes, all mankind would necessarily converge on a single language and thought process. Marr became a massive figure in Soviet academia, reigning supreme for decades. His theory was held up as a kind of Marxist alternative to bourgeois linguistics and anthropology, in much the same way Lysenkoism was propped up in opposition to genetics. It complemented the policy of building a unified Soviet culture, and it was an attack against the very real problems of using language for imperialist and nationalist ends, although at the same time playing into a kind of transnational nationalism of the oppressed peoples. Speaking of which, going hand in hand with the government's turn toward revolution in the East, Marxist Oriental Studies emerged, led by Mikhail Pavlovich and his organization VNAV. Several new party schools were founded in the coming years, with the goal of promoting interest and study of Asia, and especially in the case of toilers of the East, attracting revolutionaries from Asia to be educated in the Soviet Union. These developments all caused quite a stir in the old universities, but again, the main source of tension was over autonomy and management. From the university's perspective, they had only just managed to carve out some autonomy from the government, something which they had fought for decades to achieve and didn't want to relinquish easily. Generally, academics were in favor of state support, but they didn't want support to mean control. Many could be considered apolitical as long as they were left alone, in what has been called a feeling of nonpartisan public service, or supra-political developmental nationalism. They supported the regime, any regime, as long as it made clear its dedication to scientific progress. For this reason, technical specialists tended to be quicker to come around, since the Bolsheviks began to immediately invest in technical projects. The social sciences weren't quite as easily settled. Most cooperative of all was, ironically, the Academy of Sciences, which reached out to the Bolsheviks in the hopes of having its unique status affirmed and protected. When a major strike of school teachers broke out in January 1918, the Academy actually voted near unanimously against striking. As a result, an understanding was formed between Oldenburg and Lenin that the Academy would be a special exception tasked with working toward the economic upliftment of the country. Likely playing into this was that many Bolshevik leaders had a sort of respect perhaps even envy, we could say, for Russia's top intellectuals, in what has been called anti-intellectual intellectualism. They were militantly against the old bourgeois system, but also looked up to the old system, with a desire to be just as cultured and sophisticated. And so, the great irony of Soviet education is that the Civil War years were characterized by militarization, utopian visions, and apocalyptic threats against the old system, but was forced by necessity to be utilitarian and scaled back. While the new economic policy era that came after, characterized by rhetoric of retreat and compromise, signaled the actual attempt at aggressive overhaul. Reason being, with the Civil War ending, not only did the Bolsheviks now have resources to spare, the party, and Lenin specifically, singled out education as the next big front of the war, the cultural front. The us versus them mentality, cemented through years of fighting, translated now into the educational sphere, two hostile worlds that had to be rectified. This became especially pertinent with the start of NEP, as it was assumed this economic relaxation would necessarily incentivize political and cultural degeneration if the party wasn't vigilant. The war had to be carried on, not on the battlefield, but in the classroom. Beginning in 1920, Lenin called for a unified educational hierarchy, for communist professors to be quickly trained, and for a basic ideological program for all students. First, those party schools were now revitalized and supported. It was from them that the Bolsheviks hoped to conceive the next generation of the party, the changing of the guard, the Smena. Education through these institutes would become the ideal career path for any up-and-comer in the party. In addition to raising a diverse new student body, this also played into the emerging cadre system, in which aspiring Bolsheviks were nominated and mobilized by Bolshevik patrons, in turn becoming shaped by them. All the way down to the local level, the party created schools, study circles, and evening classes to teach political basics to incoming party workers, especially after the 10th Party Congress decreed every communist have at least some political literacy. Second, a drive began to overhaul and take over the non-party schools. Many of those independent institutes that had popped up were thus shut down or were taken over by the Bolsheviks. Proletkult itself was disbanded and absorbed into the party, Bogdanov resigning in the process. Gradually, the new schools became a unified category, directly responsive to party initiatives. This was in contrast to the old major universities, who, from the party's perspective, were resisting necessary oversight and reform at best, and breeding bourgeois activity at worst. They would need to be remolded, the party schools serving as a blueprint. To begin, the curriculum became more tightly guided, with social sciences departments being created to disseminate Lenin's program of political literacy. Next, the realm of acceptable activity as a scholar was to be decreased. Previously, Russia had a tradition of kruzhki, basically study circles or salons, whereby historians met in people's homes and held discussions or gave lectures. And with the universities on hard times, scholarly work was kept alive through such meetings. Likewise, scholars took part in historical societies and clubs in the big cities, which served both as outlets for their work and to organize mutual aid. One popular effort was the founding of bookstore cooperatives, which allowed academics to raise funds by selling or trading their libraries. Leading these efforts, until he himself left the country, was Maxim Gorky, the famous writer and friend of Lenin. During the war, he used his connections to petition on behalf of intellectuals and founded several houses of scholars, which provided food and shelter for those affected by the war. Education was initially badly underfunded, but thanks in part to Gorky's lobbying, a special ration was established for scholars in 1919, though not so for all teachers in general. Instead, it was these side organizations which kept teachers afloat, and so they were largely ignored during the Civil War. But now that the war was ending, the government turned their attention against them out of fear that they could be used as fronts for underground resistance. Plus, history, as a transnational profession involving collaboration and dialogue with historians around the world, was problematic. as it was feared the historians could be communicating with foreign agents. Another problem is that educators were taking part in school Soviets and forming teachers' unions, which organized their profession against government interference and called strikes for better conditions and pay. And likewise, so were their students. The situation finally boiled over in 1921 when the government issued a new university charter, granting them the right to appointment over rectors and administrators, and abolishing independent social organizations. This was even stricter than the Tsarist charter, and just as explosive. In February 1922, a strike broke out at the Moscow Higher Technical School, which soon spread across the country, attracting both professors and students in solidarity. On one hand, the party somewhat relented, issuing resolutions for peaceful liquidation of the strike and for some amelioration of university conditions, though the charter itself wasn't entirely rescinded. On the other hand, the party also began seriously discussing a more decisive solution, an expulsion of intellectuals. But more on that next time. Meanwhile, if professors were causing headaches for the government, so was the mass of communist students. The revolution and the many strategies to promote proletarian students had created a rising generation of communist youth who saw themselves as fighters on the front lines of the cultural front. Accounting for about a third of the student body by 1928, these eager activist students latched on to the party's calls and then some, demanding full revolution and the right to govern the schools themselves. Ironically, this was a great annoyance to the party, given it now sought normality, not chaos. Trying to make the compromise with the bourgeois professors' work, the party often found itself having to scold its own overly zealous members. Even Lenin advised moderation, stressing the need to win over professors. And so, the NEP era got off to a fiery start, with dreams of transforming the education system, but yet again having to settle for half measures. For now, a delicate compromise with the bourgeois specialists was to persist, widening the gap between the party schools and the bourgeois schools. Though the Bolsheviks had been forced to take a gradual approach, the long-term goal of complete transformation was no less desired. A growing radical section of the student body continued to clamor for change. Suspicion of the bourgeois professors remained, and meanwhile, a political struggle within the party itself was about to ramp up. How would this shake up Soviet history?